The teacher's name was Clara Dorn, and by the time she saw the first scrap of fence line in 2 days, her tongue was a curled husk in her mouth, and her boots had split at the seams. Her dress clung to her like a second skin, soaked and dried a dozen times by sweat and the wind's merciless scrape. Dust powdered her arms, her lashes, her lungs. She did not cry. The heat had taken her tears the day before, and whatever pride she had left was now buried beneath the plains like bones under prairie grass. She stumbled, caught herself on a jut of mesquite, and stood swaying. Somewhere behind her, a snake moved under rock. The wind rolled over her shoulders, dry as parchment, whispering nothing. She pressed on. The sun boiled the earth. Her shadow was just a smear at her feet. 2 days earlier, she had been a woman of some composure. Not confidence, not warmth, but order, her life at the edge of town measured by books, bells, chalk dust, and children's voices raised in stubborn defiance of arithmetic. That life had ended when the money stopped, when the county office burned down and no one came to say what would be rebuilt, when the school closed and the children were sent to their fathers' fields or to their mothers' graves. She was left with silence, with hunger, with 4 tin cans of beans, and then with none. She waited 3 days before she left the house, not out of hope, but fear of what she'd find beyond it. On the fourth, she packed a small ledger, a cracked compass, and a blanket. She left the photograph of her sister on the mantel as though she'd return. By noon, her legs were already shaking. That was 2 days ago. The land east of town gave no quarter. Drought had split the earth into plates like broken crockery. Birds flew high and vanished. Streams that once whispered at dusk were now nothing but memory. Clara walked at dawn and dusk, curling in shade at noon beneath thornbush or stone. She found no water. She passed no one. Now at the edge of her strength she saw it, a fence post, worn gray, wire stretched taut and sagging in places. Civilization of a kind. Clara reached for it, her fingers missed. She hit the dirt, cheek first, lips chapped and split against the grit. She tasted blood and salt. Her heart knocked like a trapped bird in her chest, loud and losing rhythm. She did not get up, time frayed. The wind rasped, the sun crawled higher. And then hooves, slow, deliberate, the sound of a gate creaking open, then shut. A whistle, short and low, almost surprised. A man dismounted. She did not see him at first. She heard the jingle of tack, a sigh, the crunch of boots. When her eyes opened again, they met a silhouette framed in gold light. He crouched beside her, a shadow cut from dust and leather. "Jesus Christ," he muttered. She tried to speak. The word died in her throat. "You alone." A blink, he nodded once, pulled a canteen from his saddlebag, tipped it gently to her lips. She choked, but drank. The pain of water on her throat was near holy. "You're lucky I was checking the fence," he said. She closed her eyes, not from weakness now, but shame, to be found like this, by a man like him. "Let's get you inside. You need rest, food. And the dog." His voice was firm, not unkind, but not soft either. He moved with the ease of someone used to command. When he lifted her, her body spasmed once in pain, then gave in. He carried her to the horse. The ranch was a mile off. Clara drifted in and out, catching glimpses, a wide porch, a pump, a cluster of cattle in the distance. A boy watching from the barn, a dog that didn't bark. Inside it was cool and dim. A woman with red hair took Clara's boots. Another brought broth in a mug. She drank it with trembling hands. "My name's Abram Wexley," the man said. "This is my land." Clara nodded. Her voice returned slowly, rasping like wind through ash. "I'm Clara Dorn. I was a teacher. Was. The school's gone. Where were you headed?" "I didn't know, just east." Silence settled between them. "Well," he said after a beat, "you're here now." She closed her eyes again, and for the first time in days, she did not dream of death. But the hunger inside her was not just for food. It had a name, a shape, and it would not sleep forever. The second morning, Clara woke to the smell of coffee and horses. She lay still in the room they'd given her, a narrow space off the kitchen with a cot and a single high window. The sun hadn't climbed yet, but she could hear movement outside, boots in dirt, metal brushing metal, the low murmur of animals and men exchanging brief commands. Her body ached like old timber. The muscles in her legs had seized into knots, and her lips still felt bruised. But she was alive. Clean, fed, and clothed in a rough cotton shirt and skirt that didn't belong to her. Her own dress had been taken, likely burned. She sat up, her bones protested. Her feet were wrapped in linen. She'd not been left alone to rot, that much was clear. A knock came, soft and uncertain. "You awake?" It was the red-haired woman, not much older than Clara. She entered without waiting. "We boiled potatoes. You need something in you." Clara nodded, though her throat clenched at the thought of food. Hunger had become a quiet ghost in her belly. Still, she stood. The woman gave her an appraising look, checking for strength or maybe resolve. "I'm Miriam, Wexley's sister. I saw you come in like a sack of bones. Wasn't sure you'd last the night." "I almost didn't." "Well, you did. Sit." The kitchen was warm, wood stove blazing, table scrubbed raw. The boy she'd glimpsed yesterday was eating in the corner, brown hair half in his eyes. He looked up at her with something between suspicion and curiosity. "That's Jonah," Miriam said. "Wexley's ward, not his blood." Clara nodded again. Her voice wasn't ready. Outside, the ranch moved with a rhythm all its own, riders setting off, dogs herding cattle, someone cursing near the stable. The place was large, well-run, flush with money, but not flashy. This wasn't some shoddy operation scrounging between droughts. It was the kind of land that survived wars, bought judges, buried secrets. Abram Wexley came in near noon. He'd changed shirts, hat pulled low, dust streaking his trousers. He looked at Clara only once, then poured himself a drink. "You up for speaking yet?" he asked. Clara swallowed hard. "Yes." "You got kin?" "None close. My sister died in childbirth. Parents long gone." "What about men?" Clara's mouth tightened. "If I had one, I wouldn't have walked 2 days through hell to die on your fence." He gave a nod, not mockery, not pity, just a mark of understanding. Miriam looked between them and wiped her hands on her apron. "We'll put her to work when she's strong." "I can read," Clara said, sharper than she meant. "I can do more than peel potatoes." Miriam's eyes flicked. "We don't have much need for reading out here." Wexley drained his glass. "Maybe we do now." The days turned. Clara healed, slowly. Her voice came back in full, hoarse but unbroken, her feet scarred over. She began walking again, first to the porch, then the corral, then down to the spring house where they stored milk and meat. The land was large, untamed in patches, but well fenced. Wexley owned 60 head, 6 hands, 2 wagons, and the water rights to a stream that hadn't dried since the war. He never said how he got it. Nobody asked. Clara began helping in the kitchen, then with the ledgers. She found gaps, missing numbers, lazy sums, and fixed them without fanfare. Abram noticed. She could feel it in the way he looked at her one night as she worked by lantern. "You're wasted in a schoolhouse," he said. "I was never meant to be there long." "Where were you meant to be?" She looked at him, saw something guarded behind his ease. "Someplace where people aren't so sure they know what I'm worth." He didn't answer that. But the next day he asked her to help with inventory. Guns, saddles, feed, things most women were kept from. She said yes. By the second week, Clara had walked the full spread. She knew the fence line, the eastern ridge, the dogleg creek where the boys sometimes hunted coyotes. She marked how many workers Wexley had, how they were paid, how often they looked away from certain questions. She listened. Miriam watched her with narrowed eyes, not jealousy exactly, not fear, just the cold measure of a woman who'd learned life was a ledger of debt and favor. "You're staying, then?" Miriam asked one dusk as they shelled peas. Clara didn't look up. "For now." Miriam clicked her tongue. "No one ever stays unless they want something. Maybe I want to live. Living ain't the same as staying." That night, Clara stood at the edge of the corral, watching the sky bleed orange. She thought of the school, of the dry well behind it, the headmaster who'd taken the last supplies for himself and vanished, the girls who had started skipping lessons when the fields grew hotter and their fathers meaner. She thought of the man who'd come once a week for accounting help, whose breath always smelled like whiskey and stale meat, whose hands never stayed on the ledgers. She had not screamed when he took what he wanted. Only afterward, when he left her door unlocked and told her no one would care, she thought of him now, of the way his voice crept under her skin. She was not done walking, not yet, but she needed to learn this place first. Needed to earn its quiet, its rhythms, its trust. Vengeance could not be rushed. It had to be planted, watered, raised with care like cattle under Wexley's name, and when it was grown, it would not be loud, it would not be merciful. It would be complete. The third month brought rain, not enough to change the land, but enough to darken the dirt and draw steam from the roofs. Clara stood under the awning of the smokehouse, watching the drops thread down the slats like fingers. The sky groaned, low and heavy, and the cattle turned their backs to the wind. She made herself useful, not indispensable, not yet, but necessary in small ways. She handled the ordering now, the supplies, the correspondence with traders who never saw her face. She taken over the accounts completely after catching one of the ranch hands skimming off feed costs. Wexley had fired the man without a word. That night, he'd poured Clara a glass of his private rye and said nothing while she drank it. Trust was a rare currency here, but she was earning it. Still, no one asked where she came from, no one pressed. It was as if her hunger, her collapse, had scrubbed her past clean. She let them believe it had. Only the boy, Jonah, watched her with the quiet unease of someone who remembered his own ruin. He was 12, maybe 13, too thin, too still. He rarely spoke, but when he did, it was with a sharpness that reminded Clara of her students before they learned to fear their fathers. She found him one morning outside the barn, practicing with a slingshot. His aim was good, too good. "You ever shoot a rifle?" she asked. He looked at her. "Once." "You hit anything?" "I hit a man." He went back to his stones. Clara didn't press. There was violence under the soil here, buried but not forgotten. The men spoke little of the past, but she heard things, drunken mutterings in the bunkhouse, names spat in sleep. Something had happened 2 years ago. A fire, maybe. A death that wasn't mourned. Miriam never spoke of it, but she carried herself like a woman who knew what price silence could fetch. One night, Clara caught her in the pantry, staring at an old photograph tucked behind the preserves. A younger Wexley stood beside another man, darker-haired, same jaw. The second man had been erased, his face scraped clean with a knife. "Your brother?" Clara asked. Miriam shut the door. "Not anymore." By then, Clara had found the hidden ledger. She wasn't looking for it, not exactly. But the way Wexley kept certain papers in a locked drawer bothered her. One night while the house slept and the rain came down hard, she picked the lock with a wire hairpin. Inside was an old account book, not ranch costs, names, dates, payments. At first, it looked like debts owed to the ranch. Then she understood. These weren't purchases. They were settlements, bribes, silences bought and sold. The ranch had been built on something more than cattle. She closed the book and put it back, but she remembered every name. 3 nights later, a man rode in from the east with a slick hat and a pistol too fine for dust country. He called himself Lyle Granger and asked for Wexley with a voice that curled at the end like smoke. Clara watched from the porch. She didn't like the way the man smiled or the way Wexley stiffened when he saw him. "You got business?" Abram asked. Granger tipped his hat. "Same as always, wonderin' if the price has changed." "You're 2 years late. Figured you want to renegotiate." Wexley's jaw tensed. "Get off my land." "You sure about that?" The two men stared at each other. Clara could feel the tension ripple through the air like heat lightning. Then Wexley stepped forward, one hand on his belt, the other loose at his side. "You've got 10 seconds. Granger smiled real slow, but he turned, spurred his horse, rode out without another word. Later that night, Clara found Wexley on the back steps, hands stained with oil from repairing a gate that didn't need fixing. "He was part of it, wasn't he?" she asked. Wexley didn't look at her. "Part of what?" "You had a partner once. He disappeared. Miriam won't say his name." Silence stretched. "You ran him off," Clara said, "or buried him." Wexley didn't confirm. "Didn't deny. I don't care," she said, "but I need to know what kind of man I'm standing beside." He wiped his hands on a rag, the kind who knows when to end things before they rot. "Good." She turned to leave. "Clara." She paused. "If you've got something buried, I don't want to find it later. Not here." She looked over her shoulder. "Then don't look too close." By fall, the ranch had settled back into its routine. Granger hadn't returned, but Wexley posted guards on the ridge. He started training Jonah with a rifle. Clara saw him once, guiding the boy's hands, his voice low, steady. She started sleeping less. Dreams came again. Not of the walk, but of the man from the school. His hands, the stink of tobacco on his breath, the way he'd laughed after. His name was Malcolm Laird. She'd heard it again, written in the hidden ledger, scrawled next to a payment of $500 marked Silence, East District. It hadn't been for her. There had been others, girls, names she recognized. The school hadn't burned by accident. It had been set alight by someone who wanted to erase evidence. Clara stared at the ledger night after night, hand trembling. She hadn't left to escape. She'd left to survive long enough to find out the truth, and now she knew where he'd gone. Laird had taken that money and moved east, toward the towns that still paid their teachers and welcomed quiet men with soft hands. He thought she'd died on the road. He was wrong. She was no longer starving. She was ready. Winter moved in slow and silent, the kind of cold that came not with snow but with bone-deep stillness, the land brittle as old parchment, wind cutting from the north, and breath blooming white against the window panes. The cattle drew close to the feeding stations. The ranch hands rose earlier, worked faster, drank harder. The fire in the hearth never went out. Clara didn't mind the cold. It sharpened her, focused her. Her boots were new, a gift from Wexley after she restructured the rail delivery contracts and saved him 3 months' profit. She wore them like armor. Her hands were calloused now, her face wind-worn, the softness of her old life fully buried beneath long sleeves and longer silences. Most nights she sat at the kitchen table after the house went quiet, tracing the map she'd built from scraps. Towns stitched across the plains, rail stops, names from the ledger. The last one circled in charcoal, Whitbridge. That's where Malcolm Laird had gone, not hiding, just forgotten. She was patient. She wrote letters under Wexley's name, forged his signature clean. One to the county courthouse, requesting past records of hires at the Whitbridge school. Another to a tradesman she remembered from the dry counties, a man who sold paper and owed her a favor. In return, she got names. A list of children registered at Whitbridge in the last 2 years. She recognized 2. Their older sisters had vanished before Clara ever left the town where her life had ended. He was still doing it, still walking halls with a kind voice and a predator's hunger. She folded the paper slow, tucked it inside the spine of her old ledger and didn't speak of it to anyone. But the quiet had changed in her. Wexley noticed it first. One morning in the barn, she was oiling a rifle, an old Springfield, too long for her arms. He leaned against the stall and watched. "You planning on hunting?" he asked. "I already am." His jaw worked, but he said nothing. Later that week, he rode with her to the southern ridge to check the boundary line. There, under the gray sky and frostbitten scrub, he asked the question directly. "You're not staying?" "No," she said. "I never meant to." He nodded as if he'd known all along. "I won't stop you. I didn't think you would." He pulled a flask from his coat, drank, passed it to her. She didn't drink, just held it. "She hurt you," he said after a long while, "whoever he took from you." Clara's breath caught. "Not just me," she said, "but yes." Wexley tilted his head toward the east. "There's no law out there that'll punish a man like that." "I know. You plan to do it yourself." She looked at him. "You did." He met her eyes. "And it cost more than it paid." She gave the flask back. "I'll decide what it's worth." By February she was ready. She packed light, a coil of rope, the ledger, the Springfield, and a revolver Wexley gave her without ceremony. He didn't offer to go with her. He didn't offer anything, in fact, except this: "Don't leave unfinished work here." Clara turned to look at him one last time. The porch, the barn, the boy asleep in the loft. Miriam standing at the window, face blank. "I didn't," she said. She rode out alone. The wind followed her east. The trail was long, but she knew how to move now, how to rest during windstorms and boil snow when no water ran, how to speak to freight men without drawing questions. She kept her voice low, her eyes lower, and her hand always near the gun under her coat. Whitbridge lay in a shallow valley, clean and false in its calm. The school stood 2 stories tall, painted blue, with a bell that hadn't rusted. The girls wore ribbons. The boys smiled too easily. The women waved from porches. And there he was, Malcolm Laird. Older, heavier, face fuller, but still wearing the same trimmed mustache. His voice was honey-thick as he addressed the class. She watched him from the back of the room, hidden by the coat of a visiting school inspector. He didn't see her, not then. She didn't confront him in the classroom. She waited 2 more days until he walked alone from the schoolhouse to his boarding room. She followed. No one noticed the woman in a dark coat. No one remembered her face. Inside his room, she found a record book, tucked in a drawer. Notes, names, comments. Her name was there. Clara Dorn, underlined once. A single word written beside it, troublesome. She waited on his bed. When he opened the door and saw her, he froze. His mouth opened, but no sound came. She didn't lift the gun, not yet. "Hello, Malcolm." He reached for charm first, his oldest weapon. "Well now, Clara, is it? My word, you." She stood, the revolver in her hand. "Sit." He sat. "I buried 3 girls," she said. "Before I left that town. I buried them quiet because I thought no one would believe me. You made sure of that." His smile cracked. You've had a rough time." "I never hurt anyone. That's not." "Don't speak again." She pulled the ledger from her coat, dropped it on his lap. "You're in here, paid, protected." I don't know what that is." She cocked the revolver. "I counted 6 girls here," she said. 2 from before, 4 new. You chose them same as always." "I haven't touched anyone." She fired. The bullet took his right leg. He screamed, fell backward, knocking over the chair. "I said don't speak." Blood pooled on the floor. He writhed, hand grasping at the wound. I want you to feel it, she said. What it's like to be broken open, to be disbelieved, to scream and know no one's coming. He begged. She pressed the barrel to his jaw, then lowered it. I'm not going to kill you. His eyes widened. I want you to live. She stood, but you won't teach again. You won't walk without a cane. And by morning, everyone in this town will know exactly who you are. She turned to go. He howled something behind her, a curse, a threat, a plea. She didn't turn back. At dawn, she nailed the ledger to the schoolhouse door, every page, every name, every payment. And then she rode west, the wind at her back. She didn't ride back to Wexley's land, not yet. She rode north instead, away from Whitbridge, away from the blood and the stairs and the woman at the boarding house who crossed herself when Clara passed. The sky widened above her like a wound. Rivers iced at their edges. Snow clung to the hollows of trees. She traveled slow, not to hide, but to feel the weight of what she'd done settle properly in her bones. She did not regret it. The wound she gave Malcolm would fester, not just in flesh, but in every whispered word, every sideways glance, every parent who refused to send their daughter back to school. Truth was a slow poison. It killed louder than bullets. She left her name in Whitbridge, let them speak it like a ghost. In a way, that was what she'd become, not dead, but no longer the woman who taught poetry under cracked ceilings, who swept floors for a living and lowered her eyes when men passed. At a way station outside Eller's Mill, she sold her last letter of credit and bought a mare with more heart than muscle. She took jobs when she had to, fence mending, calf pulling, one stint as a cook for a mining camp up in the Salt Hills. She listened more than she spoke, and slowly stories began to circle. Of a woman who nailed a ledger to a schoolhouse door, of a man found crawling in his own blood, stripped of every lie he'd built, of a teacher turned something else. Some called her cursed, some called her brave, a few called her righteous. She didn't answer to any of it, but she kept moving. In late spring, she returned south. The Wexley land was changed. Not in shape, still the long sprawl of fences and water tanks and ridgelines, but in feel. There was tension in the air, gates kept double-locked, riders patrolling after dusk. Smoke at the edge of the far pasture, as though something had been burned quick and without record. Miriam met her at the gate. "You're late," she said, but her arms were open. Inside, the house felt smaller. Wexley sat in the parlor with a wound stitched into his side and a shotgun propped against his knee. Jonah had grown another inch, face sharper, eyes older. The ranch hands eyed Clara with a kind of reverence, though none of them said it aloud. "Granger came back," Wexley said without waiting for pleasantries. "Didn't like the way I ended things." Clara leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "He bring men. 6, 2 left alive. And the others. Buried east of the ridge. Miriam helped." Clara met Miriam's eyes. The woman just shrugged. "Ain't the first hole I've dug." They ate dinner in silence, the kind of silence built not from discomfort but shared survival. Clara didn't ask what the price had been. She could see it in the way Wexley winced when he rose, in the dog that was missing, in the patch of ground near the fence line where the dirt was still too dark. Later, on the porch, Wexley poured them both a drink. "You find what you needed?" he asked. "I found what he took, and I ended it." He looked at her for a long time. "That ledger, the one you found, there were others in it, bigger names. You just went for him. For now. You planning to keep going?" She didn't answer. She didn't have to. He nodded. "Good." A pause. "You could stay," he said. "Not forever, just long enough to breathe." She looked out at the pasture. Jonah was out there with a rifle slung over his back, watching the tree line. The cattle moved slow. The dusk deepened. "I don't think I remember how to stay," she said. "That's all right. No one here remembers either. Clara stayed that night. Then a week, then a month. Spring turned to summer. Grass grew back where blood had sunk. The fence was repaired. The well ran strong. Men rode in, tried to buy land, found cold eyes and loaded rifles waiting. Miriam taught Clara how to brand cattle. Clara taught Jonah how to read ledgers. At night, she sat on the porch and traced maps in her head, names still owed a reckoning. Cities she hadn't seen. Women who'd never had a chance to speak. She wasn't done, but she wasn't alone anymore either. One night, Wexley handed her a list, 5 names, all marked with a small red dot. These men were partners of Granger, he said. He used to boast about them, back before the split. Why give them to me? Because they're the next layer. You cut the rot, but the root's deeper. Clara folded the paper, slipped it into her boot. When she left again, she didn't take much. Just the ledger, the revolver, the map etched into her mind. She turned once at the top of the ridge. The house glowed behind her. A boy on the porch, a woman in the doorway, a man with a shotgun leaning against the rail. She earned their silence. And their steel, she rode into the dark. The next chapter waited. The first name on the list was Ray Duval, a banker who never touched the bribes himself but moved the money through clean ledgers and dirtier hands. He lived behind steel bars and stained glass windows in Dodge Crossing, the kind of town that called itself civilized but still hanged drunks in the square when business slowed. Clara arrived on a Thursday, her coat dusty and face blank, her boots quiet on marble floors that didn't belong in the West. Duval didn't recognize her. Of course not. Men like him never saw the women who carried their ruin. She posed as a clerk sent to audit his vaults, flashed Wexley's seal, now etched into a brass badge that opened doors where bullets might not. She traced funds from Granger's old holdings straight to a child's school fund in Arapahoe that had no children enrolled. She left the ledger page behind his safe. That night, Duval was found hanging in his study. No signs of a break-in, no note, just a scrap of paper pinned to his lapel with a rusted nail. You remembered the numbers. She remembered the names. She rode before sunrise. The next town was smaller, hotter. A mining strip called Josiah's Bend, where Saul Merton had built an empire from liquor, contracts, and boys too hungry to say no. He'd been a foreman when Clara was a girl, and he'd laughed once when she spilled ink on her shoes. She remembered the laugh. It came back to her when she found him in the brothel he owned, a young girl no older than 12 pouring drinks while he played poker with 2 railroad men. Clara didn't speak. She waited outside. When he came to relieve himself in the alley, she stepped from the shadows and slit his throat with a cattle knife. He gurgled her name. She wiped the blade on his fine coat and left the girl a stack of bills and a name to trust, Miriam Wexley. Each stop after that was faster. The man in tall pine she poisoned with river hemlock. The sheriff in Coldwater she exposed in front of a church congregation, slipping a baptismal ledger into his wife's prayer book mid-sermon. The preacher had read the names aloud before anyone realized. And the last man, Isaiah Brandt, she didn't kill at all. He lived in a tent outside the border, drunk and broken, surrounded by rusted tin and the ghosts of partnerships turned poison. When she arrived, he was carving names into wood with a broken spoon. Yours was the hardest, he said without looking up. She stood over him, gun in hand. You could kill me, he muttered. But I already see them, every night, girls. Little hands, your eyes in all of M. Good, Clara said. She didn't pull the trigger. Instead, she poured his whiskey out, burned his tent, left him weeping in the mud, his fire gone out for good. It was over. She returned to Wexley's ranch the way some women return to churches after war. She didn't knock. Just stepped down from her horse and walked to the barn, where Jonah was shoeing a mule and Miriam was slicing through apples with the same knife Clara had once used to cut rope. You done? Miriam asked, not looking up. For now. Jonah handed her a flask. You want to learn to tan hides. She smiled slow. All right. The land hadn't changed. The wind still swept the plains, fierce and full of forgotten names. The cattle grazed like they always had. Wexley came out of the main house and tipped his hat. He didn't ask what she'd done. He didn't have to. That night they sat around the fire, her, Miriam, Jonah, Wexley. No stories, just silence. The kind of silence made by survival. By justice done the only way it ever could be. The scars on Clara's hands had hardened. Her eyes no longer searched the horizon for ghosts. She didn't know if peace was something she could name, let alone hold, but there was soil beneath her now, soil that didn't reject her, people who didn't need her soft or small. She walked through 2 days of heat without water. She crawled through years of silence with names burning in her chest like coals. She had survived, she had avenged, and now at last she could rest, not forever, just long enough.